Hey everyone, it's Tom here, and I am currently doing a little tutorial for a knit ribbed beanie with my Made with Love, the cottony one yarn. But in the meantime, while I'm just doing the repeat rows, I thought I'd do a little bit of a Q&A or Q&CrochA. And I know it doesn't make sense because I'm knitting, but it sounds cool. So we're gonna get into some questions. Starting knitting or crochet, I mean, it's like starting anything. Like once you start, you have to start to do it, right? Like when it comes to learning to cook, when it comes to exercise, like starting from scratch and starting from something new, you know, it's going to take a little bit of time to get used to it and get into practice to be able to do it quickly and efficiently. But at the same time, if you just enjoy the journey, enjoy the mindfulness aspect of it, like for me, knitting is all about not just about the finished products, it's about the process of it. It's the movements that I make, it's the counting of the stitches, it's the sound that knitting makes. All of that for me is something that I really enjoy. I would say the simplest thing for someone to start with, whether it's crochet or knitting, is something that is just a rectangle or a square or whatever it may be. It could be a scarf, it could be just a little patch, and you can make lots of different patches and lots of the different things that you try, different stitches, and then at the end you can sew them together and make a little blanket or a cardigan or a jumper or something. But for me, it's about trying to just practice the basics, and once you get the basics, once you know how to knit, once you know how to purl, everything else kind of just falls into place. There are lots of ways to fix mistakes, but the one thing that I would always do is if you're knitting, always have a crochet hook on hand ready to fix your stitches. So if you drop a stitch, you can use a crochet hook to pick everything back up and go all the way from the bottom all the way back to the top, which I'll do a separate tutorial for that because that's a good one. I believe, depending on what tutorials you watch in order to learn to knit, if you're left-handed, sometimes people will learn to knit in the right-handed way, but technically you can knit left-handed by transferring your needles from one side to the other or holding the yarn in a different side. But to be honest, I don't actually know. I've only ever seen knitting done in the way that I'm doing it, because when you're knitting and when you're crochet, you kind of hold the yarn in different hands depending which craft you're doing. So I think you kind of have to be a little bit ambidextrous. Big word. As a beginner, simple styles, you can find lots of different places. There's some great patterns online, there's some great tutorials online. I'm hoping to make some more because lots of people are really daunted about the prospect of making a jumper when it comes to knitting. But in my opinion, if you can make a scarf, you can make a jumper, because the construction of a very basic jumper is 2 squares, 2 rectangles, and sewn together and then seamed up the sides. As long as you leave a hole for your head, obviously, when you're sewing the shoulders together, it's actually pretty simple. So I'll do a tutorial on that eventually, because I think it's important to be able to show people that you can knit a jumper and it doesn't have to be super complicated with all the increases and decreases. Of course, you can adjust the fitting by doing it that way, but reality is if you're doing an oversized chunky jumper, you don't need to worry too much about the decreases and the fitting around the shoulder. It'll all just droop and look good anyway, you know. Good things droop. For like 2025, I want to start getting a little bit creative with the things that I make and not just making things that I knit. I want to try and combine the fact that I'm learning to sew with my knitting. So not just creating knit garments, but being able to sew things together, construct things with knitting combined. So doing a little bit of hybrid between fabric and knitting it myself. I think the first thing that I want to try and make is take a pair of jeans that I already have and then cut them up the side to then make them like bootleg and kind of like go flared, but because I've added a knit panel. So yeah, watch this space. Hiding your ends while you're crocheting is actually a lot easier than hiding your ends when you're knitting, because with crochet you can hide your ends as you go, whereas with knitting you kind of have to hide your ends at the end. I can do a little tutorial on that, so watch this space, because it's actually quite simple to hold your tail ends and crochet over it. That's the way that I like to do it. Sometimes you can see them, but if you don't mind that, it's actually all right, because you're going to have to weave them in at some point anyway. So doing it as you go is something that I find to be super useful. I taught Robbie when he was about 4 years old how to do a crochet chain stitch, and he managed to master that pretty well. But I think waiting until kids get to like 7 or 8 is kind of the ideal time to learn to knit. Of course, you can learn earlier if they're showing an interest and wanting to, because with a bit of practice, you know, kids are pretty good at learning anything. They're like sponges at this age. But once he starts showing a little bit more interest in actually wanting to learn, that's when I hope to teach Robbie how to knit or crochet properly, so that we can my dream is to sit in this office. He's just sitting over there knitting or crocheting, and I'm knitting and crocheting over here, and we're all just chatting and having a lovely time crafting together. And I think that's the beauty of craft. It doesn't have to be knit and crochet. There's so many different things, whether it's drawing, whether it's painting, whether it's sewing, whether it's weaving, candle making, pottery, whatever it is, but just doing something creative where we're all together at the same time. And we don't even need to be speaking. Like, at the end of the day, the craft is the love language. The leap from crochet to knitting, and vice versa really, knitting to crochet, they are two very different things, but at the end of the day, it is all a series of loops being pulled through other loops to create a piece of fabric. And that's the amazing thing that I love about knitting and crochet, is the fact that you start with one string of yarn or one piece of yarn, and it's all one piece, and it's just being woven together to create this beautiful texture. And I think that for me is something that's super special, but it just takes a little bit of patience at the beginning when you're crossing over from knitting to crochet or crochet to knitting. But once you get it, you'll get it, and you'll be away, you know, you'll be go, 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 and you won't even have to think about it. But it's just slightly different the way that you hold things. And I think once you get used to holding things and how you personally hold your knitting needles, how you hold your crochet hook, it's a very personalized thing. And there'll be lots of tutorials trying to explain exactly how to hold it. But I think you figuring out how you hold your needles and hook in the way that works for you is the most important thing. Knitting came first out of these hobbies before crochet. I only actually learned how to crochet because lots of the tutorials and patterns that I saw online were crochet that I wanted to make. But my coach told me that I never sit still. I'm always go, 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 and I never take time to rest and recover because I'm always out exploring and doing other things. So then Lance, my husband, said to me, why don't you try knitting? People do knitting on film sets all the time when they're trying to pass the time. And I was like, okay. So I got some needles, got some yarn, went onto the YouTube University and taught myself how to knit through YouTube videos. And then with a little bit of help from other divers from around the world, some coaches and people that I knew that knit, before I knew it, I was absolutely loving it. And then one of the biggest tips that I can give to anyone is that every time you do a project, try and do something where you're learning a new stitch or a new technique, because then your skills are constantly growing as well as your, you know, collection of finished projects. I knew somebody was going to ask this. I like knitting and crochet. I do both, and I enjoy both equally. I like the way that knit garments look. So if I'm going to make something that's like that I'm going to wear, I think knitting looks nicer and it hangs nicer. But then crochet has such an amazing chance to be able to be a bit more freeform and add things and change things and create. I feel like it's great for adding like appliques and like customizing existing clothing, because you can do surface crochet, and for me that is something that I love to do on the things that you know, if you've got a knit jumper hanging around and you've never worn, or don't wear it anymore and you want to personalize it and jazz it up a bit, surface crochet is a really cool skill and technique to be able to use to jazz up your existing wardrobe as well. Maintaining good tension is just about consistency, making sure that you're holding your needles in the same way. Don't try and make your knitting too tight. I think that's one of the biggest mistakes people make when they're knitting to start with, is that they pull it really tight because they think, well, that's going to make the neatest stitch, to make it super tight. But then it slows you down, because then you're constantly trying to be like, oh gosh, I can't push it through the stitch. But actually, when it's nice and you kind of just let it fall off your needles, it should never feel like you're pulling anything too hard, and it shouldn't be too tight on your needles. It should kind of just flow off quite nicely. So I think that's what I would say, is don't try and pull it too tight. Just try and keep it consistent, and you'll figure it out once you've been knitting for long enough. And I think that's where the practice makes perfect. You'll get what works for you with tension, and I think making garments is where it's really important to make sure you have a tension gauge, because that allows you then to have a properly fitting piece of clothing. Good question. I actually don't know when or if it will be available in the US. I hope so, or I hope that maybe there'll be a US version and we'll be able to have more crafters get involved when it comes to doing a version that isn't just for UK residents, because I know when the applications were open, people wanted to be able to get involved, but actually currently it's only for people living in the UK. But I'm hoping that we'll be able to change that soon and be able to bring it to the US too, and other countries. Getting faster just comes with practice, like anything. Like when it comes to doing math, times tables, when it comes to doing anything, if you're doing it for the first time, it's going to be slightly slower. But then once you get used to it and you kind of become a bit muscle memory, you just start going and going and going, and then before you know it, you get faster and faster and faster. You get more confident where you're putting your needles, to the point where you can almost do it blindfolded. Could I do it blindfolded? Thank you so much for all of your questions. I hope you found them useful, and we'll do another Q&A again very soon. But for now, thank you for watching, and I'm gonna get back to making this hat. I've got a few more rows yet before I start the decreases, but I'll have a hat by the end of today for sure.